This is a Cardoon. I like to call it nature's garden sculpture because they create such a statement in the garden. They're very fast growing. This is super tall. Right now I'm on a ladder and you're on a chair with a tripod, and it just shows how tall this plant is. But the value of growing this plant goes far beyond just the beauty that this plant brings. It's also an edible plant. It brings in tons of pollinators too and creates such a large amount of biomass to improve your garden. But let's go check out the seeds. I'll show you how to grow these and then we'll get into all the different things that you can do with this plant. Oh wow, look at that beautiful moth. Wow, that moth is beautiful. He's loving it down there. So these are what the seeds look like, and while you can directly sow them into the ground, I'm just going to sow them into these little seedling trays. Oftentimes the seeds are sown in spring and then grown into the summer and then right through to the cooler months where they're then ready to harvest and be eaten. I'm actually sowing these in autumn though because I found that works quite well in my area since I have a fairly mild winter. Here it only gets to around -1 or -2 degrees Celsius. And since these plants still quite like that cooler weather, they should still grow pretty well through the autumn and winter and put on a good amount of vegetation to then be ready to eat in the late winter or early spring while the weather is still nice and cool. They're not a plant that you want to harvest during the hotter months, and we'll get onto that a little bit later on and the reasons why. But first, let's just jump forward to when these seeds hopefully will germinate. So it's been a few weeks and the seeds are sprouting and they're looking pretty nice, and I'm just going to keep them growing in here until they get a little bit bigger. Okay, they've reached a bit of a larger size now. They're looking nice and strong, so they're ready now to be planted outside in the ground. The main thing about these is that the soil that you want to plant them in needs to be free draining, so not in an area that gets boggy or wet or anything like that. And Cardoons also really like the sun, so I've got a nice sunny spot here in my food forest. I'm also going to mulch these plants, which is something that I'd recommend. I'm using wood chips. This should help to protect the roots from cold temperatures, and also when we get to summer, it should stop them from drying out as fast. Through the cold months, the Cardoons continued growing and putting on some really nice growth. You can see these leaves are just looking really beautiful. After just 6 months of starting these plants, we're now in early spring and the Cardoon has turned into this magnificent plant with these huge, almost prehistoric looking leaves. During the colder months is when it's best to use the edible parts of the plant, which are these thick leaf stalks. And you can see they're nice and thick, they're a fairly light whitish colour, and since the weather is still cool, it's a good time to eat them before they start going to flower. We will cook some of these up in just a minute, but I wanted to tell you about a process called blanching that these plants often go through before they're eaten. This is when the leaves of the Cardoon are all pulled up in an upright position and tied together, and then the stems of the plant are covered. Traditionally they were covered with soil where it would be mounded up all around the plants fairly high, but it was a lot of work to do that. So often what's done now is they're covered with cardboard or fabric or even dark plastic. Those stems often remain covered for maybe a month, sometimes even 2 months, before the whole plant is then harvested during the winter. So the purpose of that blanching is to stop the sunlight from reaching the stems of the plant. It makes them go a whiter colour because they're not developing the same chlorophyll that they normally would. And that whiter colour in the stems indicates that they'll have less bitterness and they'll be more tender and milder in flavour. As you can see, I haven't done this process with my plants, but since it's such early spring, these haven't had much light over the winter anyway, and the leaves are keeping themselves fairly shaded. So the stems themselves still have a fairly white appearance, and they're nice and thick and juicy looking too. I'm not going to harvest the whole plant, that would be a huge amount of food for just me, so I'm just going to try some of these stems and then I can show you some of the other uses for these plants after that. So to prepare these stems, I'm just taking off that outer ridge of both sides of the stem, and already you can see that even just one stem is a pretty substantial amount of food. And the stems actually look quite a lot like celery. With these extra leaf trimmings, I'll use them as mulch in the food forest, and by the way, this is one of the most useful things about these plants. I'll often chop off a bunch of the outer leaves, stems and all, which are filled with a lot of moisture and nutrients, and I'll chop them up and lay them on the ground. And since Cardoons create this biomass very quickly, it's such a good way to grow my own mulch and nourish the soil with good amounts of organic material. So we're going to quickly make 2 different dishes with the Cardoon to try out. The first one being battered fried Cardoon and the other one stuffed Cardoon stalks. Both of these require the same initial steps, so I'm peeling the stalks to remove those tough outer fibres on the outside. And with this inside edge, you can just start cutting the thin skin off, and then the rest should easily peel away. Ah, that's so satisfying. As you prepare these, it's a good idea to drop them into some lemon water and that will stop the stems from going brown once you've peeled them, kind of like apples. This is a piece of the completely raw cardoon, so you can actually eat these in salads, which I thought was probably a bit weird since I imagined it to be quite bitter, but I've removed all of the green parts on this, so let me give it a try. So it's a little bit stringy, but there's no bitterness at all. It's actually not bad. I imagine probably if you like cut this that way a little bit against the strands, then it would make it even less stringy. But you could probably just eat it with like some hummus. Let's try that. That's actually quite good. It's very juicy, refreshing, and nice with the hummus. I actually would eat it like that. But for the rest of the cardoon, let's cook it up. So we're going to boil it in a pot of well salted water. I'll leave them in here for around 25 to 30 minutes until the pieces are tender but still with a slight bite to them. This process is often the first step of cooking with cardoon, as it helps to break them down and reduce the bitterness, and it prepares them for whatever meal you choose to incorporate them in. Okay, so for the deep fried cardoon, I'm heating up some vegetable oil in a pot and making a batter of 1/2 cup each of flour and corn flour, plus 2/3 cup of sparkling water and some salt. Alright, let's get these coated and drop them in. These shouldn't take long to cook, maybe only a minute or so, and when they're nice and golden, you can take them out and drain them on a paper towel. I'm sprinkling them with salt and serving them with a lemon wedge, and I reckon these look pretty awesome. So let's taste them. Yum! These are actually really good. The batter on the outside is nice and crunchy, and then the lemon and the salt adds that really nice zingy saltiness. And the inside, the cardoon itself, has quite a silky texture. It's quite surprising how silky and nice texture it's gone. And because it does have those strands, although those have like broken down to the point where it's easy to bite through, you sort of know that there's some texture in there. It's not just like a mushy vegetable. This holds its shape really nicely. I really like it. It's honestly so good. This next recipe of stuffed cardoon is pretty easy, and there are a bunch of different ingredients you could use. I'll put the full details of this plant-based option in the video description, but basically you just make a stuffing and a sauce. So I'm starting off with stir-frying some onion, garlic and capsicum for a couple of minutes. And to that just adding some tomato, breadcrumbs, fresh thyme and oregano, lemon zest and juice, plus some salt and pepper. And I'll cook this all up for just a couple of minutes until the stuffing mix all comes together. For the sauce, I'm just combining some canned tomatoes, some veggie stock, herbs, salt and pepper, and letting that simmer for around 10 minutes. Now we've just got to stuff the cardoon pieces with the stuffing we made, and then arrange them in a baking dish with some of the sauce underneath and some on top of the cardoons. Now I'm going to bake this for around 25 minutes until they're heated through and the sauce is nice and bubbly. And there we go. I reckon this could make a pretty nice side dish, but let's see how it tastes. Yum, I would even say that's better than the battered one. This is so delicious. It's like a real summery kind of meal, and you could get super creative with this and stuff it with a bunch of different stuff. I reckon it's a big thumbs up from me. Cooking with cardoons is not even the main reason I grow this plant, so let's cover some of the other benefits of cardoons and other things they're used for. In my opinion, these are very beautiful and ornamental plants, and since they provide so much lush growth and beauty in winter, I love having them in the garden and flourishing while much of the garden is dormant. The leaves kind of hang over the pathways a bit, and it leads to quite an immersive feeling in the food forest. As well as this, due to their large size and decent height, they do cut down on wind exposure and give some cold protection to some of my other plants growing near them, which can especially help the more sensitive plants that I grow. One thing that I have noticed though, which I try not to do with cardoons now, is to plant any trees kind of right under where the leaves will be hanging over the top of, because it does seem to slow down the growth of those plants, especially if they're just immediately planted right up close to where the cardoon is. I've noticed the same thing with weeds too though, where around the base of the cardoons you'll notice significantly less weeds growing and sprouting and able to thrive. So another word for this is allelopathy, which in simple terms refers to plants that are able to release chemicals that affect the growth of neighbouring plants. There's not a ton of information that I could find about that, but there are a few studies I found talking about how cardoon leaf extract has shown promising inhibitory effects against weed seed germination, which suggests its potential as a bioherbicide. So this could potentially be used to your advantage, where if you wanted to suppress weeds in a certain area, you could plant these, which might just have some effect on the neighbouring weeds and how well they grow. But overall, I've found these to be a really great plant in the food forest, even if there are other things around. I just try not to plant trees like right in the drip line of the plant, and it's totally fine. As we approach late spring, the Cardoons start to develop a large flower stalk with multiple flower heads, and this provides a massive amount of structural beauty even before the flowers open up. I reckon they look pretty awesome and provide a lot of interest. About a month into summer, the flowers are now blooming, and here in New Zealand it's right around Christmas time. It's an absolute scorcher of a day here in midsummer at the moment, and these Cardoons are just looking absolutely incredible. They've got to a height of probably around 7 feet tall. They're covered in these amazing coloured flowers and they're in full bloom, just covered in bees, like lots of bumblebees and other insects. Here's one just coming in now. And it's just so awesome that this was literally a seed around 9 months ago. These are definitely a great plant for the food forest to create some really great height, structure, pollination benefits, and having the ability to be able to chop and drop the leaves to improve the soil. And the fact that they're edible as well adds another great benefit to these. Even if you don't eat them, all the time, it's always there, and it kind of produces more food security in your garden by having a range of different things that you can eat, even if you might not eat them regularly. Plus, they've also been utilised by some of my bottle gourd plants that have climbed up the flower stalks to get more sun. You can see here, like that one there is fully finished flowering, so all of the blue has kind of dried back, and now this is starting to produce the seeds inside. And then you've got ones like this one here. This is yet to flower, so it's going to flower over a fairly good amount of time. Once the flowers had finished, I chopped the plants off at the base, and despite the plant dying right back, the roots remain alive, so the Cardoon will reshoot from the base towards the end of summer when the temperatures are more mild, and it will begin another annual cycle of vegetative growth, followed by flowering again next summer. If you do leave the plants to fully develop the seeds, the flower heads will release the seeds, often attached to a pappus, which is this fluffy thing here, and that's responsible for carrying the seed away in the wind. As well as everything we've talked about so far, Cardoon have some other interesting uses too, like the flowers being used as a natural rennet in cheese making. The leaves have also been used in paper production, and they've got some uses in traditional medicine too. I really enjoyed trying out different uses that plants have, like in this video here, where I show you 7 surprising ways to use and eat sunflowers. So I hope you enjoy that, but thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.